Okay. Good evening. My name is Margery Gans, and I am a member of the board of the Writers' Room of Boston. I'm delighted that you could join us this evening for the November interview in our virtual series, Writers' Room After Hours. For anyone new to us, the Writers' Room of Boston is a co-working space in downtown Boston for any and all writers, both established and emerging, who want or need a quiet place to write and a community of other writers to meet with in person in the room. We've been serving the writers of the greater Boston area since 1993, and the room is open 24 hours a day, and it provides desks and the quiet companionship of other writers. And also, we've been adding community events. We had to get through all the pandemic, but now we're able to put in community events in the room that focus on writing and on the community of writers. We have open houses, we have evenings for writing together, as well as online writing events. So during and since the pandemic, the Writers' Room began offering online resources. That includes this interview series, monthly readings from the room series, and an online writing group with prompts and discussions. Some of the programs for members include something called Draft and Dialogue, which is an informal meeting where members have time to write, share, followed by drinks and dinner. Obviously, this is in the room. A fiction feedback group where writers present their work and group members take turn asking questions with an emphasis on literary fiction. You can contact us if you'd like to know more or have any questions about the room and its programs. Check Facebook, Instagram posts at Writers of Boston. Our website has photos, announcements, and that's where you can find the recordings of past readings from the room, as well as interviews from this series. We would be delighted to have new members. We have different levels of membership, including a virtual membership for those who can't easily make it downtown to the room. And if you're interested, please check out the website, writersroomofboston.org. This interview series began in 2023 when we decided to expand the time we get to talk more in depth with individual writers and people associated with books and the arts. We hope to speak with people with a wide range of expertise. This series is made possible by grants from the Mass Cultural Council and the Boston Cultural Council, and we also rely on friends. If you enjoy this program, please consider making a contribution using the donate button on the website. Also, we will be recording this interview and a replay will be available on the website. Tonight, I'm speaking with Gish Jen, who is a former member of the Writers' Room and a fiction writer, as well as an author of some essays. Gish Jen is the author of 6 novels, 2 books of stories, and 2 works of nonfiction. Her honors include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the Fulbright Foundation, as well as the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction and the Mildred and Harold Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her stories have been chosen for the Best American Short Stories 5 times, including the Best American Short Stories of the Century. She lives with her husband in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Bad Bad Girl is her latest novel. I also noticed just this evening, so I will say that she is the author of the week in a news magazine called The Week. And she talks about her novel, but she will talk with us tonight. So, Gish Jen, please come back.
Hello.
Hi. So, we've talked a little bit about what we're going to talk about, and we've got the brand new book, which if you'd like, you could read from it right away, and then we can get talking, because a lot of what I'm going to sort of ask you about is how you conceived of it and what you were hoping to do with it, because it's such an interesting mix. I mean, it reads very autobiographically, but I know it's also some fiction. And so I'll be asking you questions sort of in that area. But if you think it makes sense to sort of read some so the audience can get a flavor, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So my new book is called Bad Bad Girl. And I am the bad bad girl in the title. As Margie suggests, it is autobiographical. But there's actually another bad girl in this book, that is my mother. My mother grew up in the 1930s in Shanghai in a very, very wealthy household, which I think it's fair to say she would just as soon not have had to leave. But thanks to history, she ended up immigrating to America, ended up in New York, where she had 5 children, the second of whom was me. And I think it's fair to say that I was not the daughter of her dreams. I had a very difficult relationship. But in the end, this book is not just a litany of a daughter's complaints about her mother. It's really an effort for me to see my mother in the round as a person in her own right with her own struggles, quite apart from me. So in this book, I am writing both as a daughter, but also as a novelist, and I try to maintain those two positions. In the end, I will say also that it is also finally an homage to her and all that she's done. And while it gets at the nature of parent-child relations generally, I think it's also particularly an homage to immigrant parents who do so much to establish their families here in America. So maybe I'll just read a little bit from the beginning to kind of set you a little bit. I'll talk about how it is that I end up talking to my mother so much, to my dead mother in this book. But anyway, I do talk to her a lot during this book. And if you were looking at the book, you would see that the sections where I'm talking to my dead mother are in bold italics. Okay. But I think you'll get a sense of it from the beginning. My mother had died, but still I heard her voice. Your grandmother was Suzhou Beauty, she says. Do you know where is Suzhou? Of course, I say, west of Shanghai, for I do know. Shanghai is where the classic Chinese gardens are, the humble administrator's garden, the lingering garden, the garden of the master of the fishing nets. West of Shanghai is the correct answer. But my mother does not say so. She is the same now as she was when she was alive, a master of the art of withholding. Your grandmother was a Suzhou beauty, my mother says again. She spoke Suzhou dialect. Chinese people say it is like singing. And she was tall and thin, by the standards of 1920 Shanghai, that is. Meaning thin, but maybe not so tall, I think, as was my mother in her youth, too. Although I mostly picture her in her late life, big bellied stage, when she had the bulbous shape of a snake that has swallowed a large animal. Her stomach was so perfectly spherical that had she not been in her 90s, you might have thought her pregnant, and indeed was likely the result of her 5 children, the second of whom was me. But whatever. Go on, I say. All my life, after all, I've wanted to know how our relationship went wrong, how I became her nemesis, her bête noire, her lightning rod, a scapegoat. You look like her, she says, only not so tall, not so thin, not so beautiful. Oh, I laugh. Now, this is the mother I remember, tactful as a sledgehammer. You were too kind. When I see you, I see her, she says. Oh, no. Your mother, I say? Because of all the possible misfortunes of birth, to remind your mother of a mother who had rejected her is surely one of the worst, as well as it seems a great unmentionable. For what does she immediately say but that girl? You don't know how to talk. Well, she wasn't exactly the mother of your heart, was she? I say. That was your nursemaid, the one you called Naima, milk mother, right? The one who was sent away. She neither agrees nor disagrees, but then she repeats Naima, and dead as she is, she begins to cry. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Even as you're reading, I'm sort of, all of these associations are coming in my mind. And one of the most powerful things about the book for me, and you mentioned about immigrant parents, um, was the way that you give us the whole context, really, of your mother's life in terms of the history of what was going on in the earlier part of the 20th century. Then she comes here in 1945. And then, of course, in 1949, the communists come in. How, I think anybody writing something like this would have to think about that. How did you balance out how much sort of history and context to include and also keep this wonderful, deep personal focus?
Well, it's not a matter of balance. It's, anyway, that is a writing challenge, right? So people have sort of said like, wow, so many characters, and you can still, and still you don't lose focus. And that is all I can say is that is the art of the novelist. It's my job to keep focus and yet have a lot going on, but not lose track of where I'm going.
Mhm.
So, but you are right that it was certainly a tricky thing to do. I did it using um, many um, devices, I guess you would have to say. For example, I use the letters, her family's letters. Those letters are mostly from life, but I do doctor them in places in
Mhm.
order to try to give historical context. For example, when the Great Famine is going on, in fact, in my actual family's letters, they didn't say anything about it. They were under so much scrutiny they didn't dare say anything. You know what I mean? Because my grandfather had been a very prominent banker. They knew they were being watched and they said nothing. Now, as you know, tens of millions of people are dying.
Right.
So as a novelist, I add, a joke, they joke about why my grandfather has died. And I add a joke, some says that, he couldn't bear to see the spring flower, something, something, something. And then somebody else jokes, he just couldn't really bear to eat any more winter cabbage, right?
Mhm.
And so that's my way of cluing the reader in as to what is going on. And I do a lot of things like that because there is a lot of history to cover. And this is not historical novel, so this is not the kind of novel where it's really about the Cultural Revolution and we just need some individual figures so to put a face on history. I'm really interested in the way that history shaped my mother's life. So it's not about history, it's about her. And I'm interested in the way that those forces shaped her life and therefore shaped mine and shaped our relationship. I mean, it's one of these things that, had she not had to come to America, had none of this, had there not been so many revolutions, I mean, there are a million contingencies in her life, and I'm very aware of them. And, and that's in many ways, that is my story. I mean, there's many ways of looking at this book. And as we hope, of course, anything that is worth writing, we hope that there will be many ways of looking at it.
Mhm.
But one of the ways certainly is just the role that history plays in all of our lives. And it's kind of hidden in the background there, so you might not realize, just either how fortunate or how unfortunate you have been. But I think that when I look at my mother, it's clear to me that she was very unfortunate. Could she have been more unfortunate? Of course. She could have been a peasant in France and, what I mean, the 1600s, and that would have been worse.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of things. It could be a lot worse.
Right.
But from the point of view of our happy upper middle class lives here, here in the Northeast, she was pretty unlucky, and a lot of her potential was squandered.
Mhm.
And she lived with a level of oppression, a level of sexism, a level of oppression, rich as she was, um, that she in many ways learned to deal with and learned to deal with via her family. I mean, in other words, a lot of what she learned about power, came to inform her, the way that she approached raising a family and her ideas about keeping order, I guess, within the family, had to do, were very much influenced her relationship with me. I mean, I think that those ideas, which really, I'm talking about cultural ideas, if you looked way, way, way back, a lot of those ideas are tied to survival, as many of our cultural ideas are. So they're pretty deep. So, her understanding about how you survive in the world is really by keeping family order.
Mhm.
It's almost as if our family, like we are marching through a forest in Vietnam and there's enemy
Mhm.
fire all around us. And it is really important that everybody follow orders. Her mindset is kind of much more like that than it is like the mindset of my average friend, my average friend in Scarsdale, New York.
That's for
Where,
sure.
life is pretty good. They're not too worried. It's really about like, what are you going to do to fulfill yourself? That is not the program that my mother was on.
Mhm.
And like I say, in a very deep way, it wasn't the program she was on. And of course, that for me to be on that program was very disconcerting to her.
I mean, I think one of the things that you do so well, and you do this in a couple of areas, but even as you're talking, I'm thinking how you take a history that you don't know everything about, but to make it a novel that does justice to what you want to write, you're able to kind of take that history, as you said, maybe, some of the letters weren't exactly what they were, but I think you and I had some back and forth on email where I said how much this book affected me as I was reading it. And I can get to that without exposing too much. But now that you're talking, I'm thinking, my grandparents were immigrants and I know nothing about their lives except their lives here. And so were I to try and write this similar book and how that came down through my father, I just don't have any information. But you're sort of saying, but you could make it up. There's a way in which you can do justice to your characters and still make it up. And that seems like what you've done here. It just, it's very inspiring, actually.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, a number of people have sort of said, like, oh, after I read your book, someone had written a memoir. She said, after I read my book, after I read your book, I realized, oh, I would completely my memoir completely differently today. But it's very important to me. That's why we call it a novel, though. I mean, so
Mhm,
if you're making like whole sections up, and I am, and because I was not alive in
mhm,
the
right.
1930s, and I did not grow up under the Japanese and
Mhm,
occupation, and everything I know is secondhand. Now I'm a good guesser, and I'm very good at extrapolating
mhm,
from, from what I'm told to what it must have been like. And
mhm,
I've done that in other novels as well. In World and Town, I did a lot of research into the Cambodian community,
mm,
and I imagined my way into that. I mean, you've got to do your homework, right? I mean, let me just start there. You do have to do your homework.
yeah.
But having done my homework, I imagine my way into these characters' lives, and later on, one of the somebody, was actually the sister of one of the people who had been a major source of information for me, said to me, she said, it's as if you held a mirror up to our lives. It's as if you were there. And,
Mhm,
and that's the novelist's training. It's my job to be able to take a good guess.
mhm,
And so, but I am guessing finally. And I am only guessing. But I'm guessing for a reason. And the
mhm,
reason is I want to understand my mother, and
mhm,
that really does start with understanding the context in which she grew up,
mhm,
which was incredibly sexist. I mean, sexist, here we think that sexism means you put your hand up in the classroom and no one calls on you,
mm.
And sexism, I mean, sexism means like, oh, like who should we have, head this team? Well, it automatically goes to the guy. Well, that is sexism, and that is a problem. But my mother's mother, when I asked her, my mother's father is this big banker, right? So he's always has all these garden parties in Shanghai, lots of foreigners. And my grandfather, who speaks no English, would be them for a garden. He's very gregarious, and he'd be like, "Hello, hello," it's all he can say. And my mother remembers that. And then I said, well, Mom, well, what did your mother say? And she says, she does not say too much. She is sort of like in the background. I mean, that was her job, was
Mhm,
to shut up and be in the background. And very famously too, my grandmother had never been heard to laugh aloud.
mm,
That's a level, I mean, that's very different than they're not calling on you in the classroom. I mean, so, that's the standard against which my mother is being held, and which my mother is flunking big time. You're right.
mm,
My mother is rambunctious. She is smart. She's articulate. And to her mother's horror, she has been sent to an international school. where she's getting all these ideas. My grandmother is illiterate. My mother speaks English and French, reading all these books. And, there's a lot of tension between her and her mother.
Yeah. And I think again, both the immigrant experience for anybody who has an immigrant experience in their background, and also, as you and I talked about a little bit in email, the whole mother-daughter experience. I mean, when you were writing, it's kind of a classic relationship that has its stereotypes, but for a lot of us, there's also a lot of truth in those stereotypes. And what interested me was how, in many ways, it felt very familiar, even though my mother was sort of as waspy as they come. But and it made me think about the ways that cultures actually can echo each other, even where they're incredibly different. I mean, my mother's ancestors came here like I don't even know how long ago. But when you were writing this, how much were you thinking about sort of the mother-daughter relationship as a way to sort of give this to the reader as something they could join?
No, I'm only thinking about the particular, but
Okay.
but I am a writer, and
Yeah.
I am aware that if you are scrupulous about the particular and you really get to the heart of it, that you will find the universal there. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? That,
Yeah.
I do know that, those things are simultaneously true. But certainly any kind of attempt to, get at the general mother-daughter
Mhm.
relationship is doomed to fail.
Right.
Well, it is,
Yeah.
it's, you have to be writing about the particular. Um, but anyway, but of course, well, once done, I'm thrilled that my book has
Yeah.
spoken to so many people
Mhm.
from so many different backgrounds.
Yeah. So in a bigger context as a writer, given that you've written lots of different kinds of writing, how what was it like coming to this? Did you have to shift gears, or how did you think about as you decided to do this?
Well, this is a book. A lot of people have asked me, well, were you waiting all these years to write this book? You were waiting for your mother to die. And that is just not at all the case. I mean, the two books I wrote right before this could not be more different than this book. So the penultimate book was The Resistors, which was a,
Mhm.
post-automation surveillance state baseball feminist dystopia, right? So, I mean, it couldn't be more
Oh,
different,
that,
you know?
yes.
And then
Right.
I had done Thank You, Mr. Nixon, which is really kind of a recap of, the last 50 years of, Chinese American history, the history of China and America, over the last 50 years since Nixon went to China, in stories. I mean, again, very, very different. And I'd never really written very personally. I think interestingly, people always assumed that it was all autobiographical. And I always felt like, please give me a little more credit. You
Right.
know? Actually, this is all a man, but whatever, it's my job to make it real. And then when you make it real, then they think it's real,
Hmm. Right.
But well, what happened is my mother died during COVID, and like all daughters, sort of overcome by grief. And I am in the habit of sitting down at my computer every day, and I sat down, and lo and behold, it couldn't work. Instead, I started writing to my mother, and of course, my mother, being my mother, started writing back. And that was the origin of these dialogues that you see in the book, right? And, but as I kind of became more kind of involved with her, I began to ask myself, well, how did she, like, why were you this way? Like, why were you this way? Why did you do these things, things that, there's in some ways were very similar, but she did many things that I would never do, right? Never,
Mhm.
never, 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 never. And I was just thinking, well, how did she become that way? And so I started, to write a memoir. And, the memoir was really for myself and for my children, right? And, my children had not had a very good relationship with her. And, so I sort of wanted to explain to them, this is also partly I wanted to explain China. I always wanted her to write something. not to explain our relationship, but just to explain China, because, as the generations go on, you can't believe how quickly it recedes.
Right.
And I wanted, what you were sort of saying, you don't know anything about your grandmother. Well, I wanted them to know, I wanted them to have some idea of who she was and where she came from, which she would never write it up. But anyway, so, but as I started to write it, the first time, I only had a very few facts. My mother refused to be interviewed for most of her life. It wasn't until 92 she finally relented and let me interview her. That's how I knew the story about her nursemaid. I knew that story as soon as she told me. I knew that, oh my God, at 92 it comes out that this was really the seminal, trauma of my mother's life. Um, because her nursemaid, when she was 7, was summarily fired, and she had been much closer to her nursemaid than she was to her mother. I mean, her nursemaid really was her mother. And all of a sudden, one day you wake up and she's gone,
Yeah.
and my mother remembers like going all over the house looking for her, all going to the servants' quarters, which she had never been before, going to the kitchen where she had never been before. And she's going all these places looking, looking, looking. And also at 92, my mother, who famously kind of never really cried, at 92, my mother cried. And,
Oh,
and I could see that this was just an incredibly painful memory for her. But, when I wrote it up as, based on what I knew, my kids kind of like, oh, wow, that's too bad, but they didn't
oh,
really they didn't react the way, I felt like, they are not really getting that this is like a really big deal for a 7-year-old, like a really big
yeah.
deal, such that, 85 years later, you will still cry. And then I tried fictionalizing it, and I thought, okay, let me just give it a try. And I made up a nursemaid, right? And I gave her a personality, I gave her an appearance. I made up a rambunctious little girl, sort of like what I thought my mother must have been like, I made up other characters, I kind of drew it all in. And this time, when the nursemaid is fired, they went, oh my God, right? Then it landed. And that's when I realized, like, oh, I see. The way into this story is through fiction. And then, as so I'm just starting to work and work and work, and I have a larger story to tell, about mothers and daughters and family patterns and trauma. I hate that word in a way. I mean, I don't want this book to be like about trauma. It's about a
I
lot
know.
more than trauma. It's a lot about history and other things, but it is partly about trauma. And as I'm writing, it is dawning on me that, that I have actually am now writing a book, and that it's a book about, where I'm trying to understand my mother. Also, a lot of materials have surfaced, they're surfacing as I'm writing, right? So my mother has died, and so we go to clean out her storage locker, and lo and behold, there are papers, like not very many papers, but there are letters, and I have the letters translated, and I'm thinking, oh my God, no wonder she never talked about her mother. She had a terrible relationship with her mother. Things like that started to surface, and so I'm kind of working through them in real time. So as you can sort of see, and her teaching log, she had been asked by the administration. She was working in an inner city school, a job for which she was completely unprepared. And it's a very, very rough school. It's a lot of violence, and the administration has asked her to keep a log of everything that went on, really, so that they have to throw anybody out of school. They have a record of what the kid did, that they're throwing the kid out of school, and you know, things like that, and basically when I have materials like that, I just use them verbatim, in other words. So the book is very much a blend between, there are things which are completely fictional, and then there are things which are completely, from life. And but overall, I'm using them both to get at a larger truth, right? Tim O'Brien sort of said, we have fiction because sometimes the truth isn't enough to tell us the truth,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also, by the way, facts lie.
Mhm.
I mean, I was just thinking, there's just a picture of of a soldier coming back from World War II, in the Times. I think it just ran like yesterday, where in the picture, the picture is all about his being welcomed home with just overwhelming joy. This girl is jumping for joy and her both feet are in the air. But the reality was that his marriage was breaking up, and that, in other words, so, what looks like fact does not always tell the story either, right? So, but basically I'm kind of using everything at my disposal. Whatever tells the story best. And I will say, as it's clear that it's a book, if it's gonna if it's gonna be a book, I want the book to work. And as you correctly said from the beginning, actually, this is like a lot of material, like a lot of material.
Mhm.
So, but it doesn't read that way. And that's
Mhm.
because I have some through lines. And so I have some characters that I am using to kind of bring the whole book, to move it all forward. So we don't bog down, in the Japanese occupation, right? Then we don't bog down in any of these many things, all of which are horrific, right? Um, so I use characters, I just, some of them are wonderful characters who are just they're wonderful characters, although I'm using them, for example, the larger truth is that my mother was very isolated, right? And how do you, bring home that she was so isolated, right? So I'm trying to bring this home for my children and then now for a larger audience. And that is to give her a friend and then have the friend leave. And it's when the friend leaves that you realize, like, oh my God, she's so alone. But if she had never had the friend, you don't, do you know what I mean? You can't understand it in the same way. So she had there's some basis for truth there too. My mother apparently did have a friend, and this friend became my godmother. I
Mhm.
never met her. I think that my mother lost touch with her, quite early on, or they were not in the same city. And so, the many scenes I have of Marnie Mulligan bringing her, little gifts and stuff like that, that's all fiction. What's not fiction is that there really was such a woman who clearly loved my mother and loved me.
Mhm.
And she did send to me all my first books, my first copy of Little Women, Heidi. This was a good woman. She's a good-hearted woman. She had only held me once when I was a baby and I was baptized. She really didn't have to keep, stay interested in me my whole life the way that she did. She never forgot me. Every Christmas, she sent me a present, a long letter. And from that, I drew Marnie Mulligan, so you can sort of see there's a great truth there. At the same time, Marnie Mulligan is fictional.
Mhm. I mean, what impresses me is that I know, different authors sort of plan out their work or don't plan out their work, or they know the end, or they let the end appear, that you kept your eye on the goal of why you were writing this and what you wanted. And then you let it evolve from the one that you wanted to show your kids and it kind of didn't work. They didn't get it. And then you let the whole project sort of grow so it could do what you wanted it to do. And I think that's an interesting process to go through because there are some people who would just stop and say, well, it can't be done. When you wrote other things, did you give them that kind of room to grow or did you not need to? What was your
Yeah,
process in that sense?
I've always been that way. I mean,
Mhm.
I always let the story, the work talk back to me.
Mhm.
I've always let it evolve the way that it wanted to evolve. Um, yeah, I've always followed the work. Well, I follow the work, it's yourself thinking, it's like you're talking to yourself and then you wake up in the morning, you think something else. But I will say that if it's not evolving of its own accord, something has gone wrong.
Mhm.
I mean, it should be an organic thing, which, like I say, has a life of its own.
Mm-hmm.
so that you are both directing it and not directing it, and I think that that's a sign that really that it's coming, it's coming up from your subconscious,
Mm-hmm.
so that you aren't, you're in control, but you're not in control, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of both. In this case, because it was going to end with my mother's death, I had a little more sense of where I was going than maybe with others, um, with other books. But what's also true is that, and I had a sense of how that was going to work, which was, I have to say that, when I wrote The Resistors, that was my baseball novel.
Mm-hmm.
I was the first time I'd ever worked in something that was, like genre-like, right? And I knew it had to end in a big game.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, I was pretty nervous. I mean, I knew that it had to be a big game that on one hand was entirely inevitable, on the other hand had a big surprise. And I don't want to give it away, but when I realized, like, oh, I know just the pitch that she should
Mm-hmm.
throw, or anyway, I won't give it away. When I knew that what you had to do on the pitcher's mound, I was greatly relieved. It just kind of came to me. Just I don't know from where. In this case, I kind of knew where I was going. The bigger trick was to shade, as I do. Like I say, there's a lot of nonfiction all the way through, but to shade from fiction to nonfiction without this big jolt. When you come to
Mm-hmm.
part five and it's pretty memoiry,
Mm-hmm.
to have it to manage that gradient from the beginning to the end. And um and yeah, that I would say, well, that was a tricky piece of writing.
I mean, I'd have to say that now that I'm hearing you describe more what your process was, I think it's just incredibly successful
Well,
because there was no place as I read it that I felt jolted from history to personal, or there's no place where I would have known something because it all blends together in such a coherent story, that drives toward the end. But I just think you did a great job.
well, thank
And
you.
and
But the
and
result is that people think that it's memoir, and they say that it's not really a novel. I'm like, "No, trust me.
it is a
There's
novel. Well, and
a
that's
lot of craft in this book. It's a novel. It's
and
definitely
that's
a
what's
novel."
helpful to hear about, because I think anybody who sets out, there's this whole category of quote unquote creative nonfiction,
Mm.
which I'm not sure existed 20 years ago. But it gives people the option to sort of use parts of their lives or something that's quote nonfiction and then let it grow in a way that, can feel wonderful to an author. It's liberating. So I think that's, and when you started other novels or other pieces or even short stories, given that you have this dialogue back and forth, and again, I'm asking questions for writers, when you started, did you feel like you sort of knew where this piece was going?
No, I didn't even know it was going to be a long piece. I mean, like I say, it was just really started as a
But
little experiment.
let me just,
And
I mean, when you wrote other things, like, is this your process when you write short stories or other novels, that you sort of let the thing grow and again have this dialogue, or are you any more sort of like, oh no, I want to write this novel about like
yeah,
baseball or something else?
it's always this organic thing where it grows.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been. I mean, I'm amazed people can outline this story. I'm like, how? I don't know how they do that, and I would
Mm.
never. I've never done that, and I would never understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I do sometimes if something. I can see that something seems to be stalled out, or you know what I mean. Like I think that I have kind of maybe lost track of what the conflict is actually in a book, because books are big and messy, right? And
Yeah.
you need to not get lost, and so if I've left, I might go back and diagram what's happened up to now so that I can see
Mm-hmm.
what my arc is up to that point. Do you know what I mean? So even though I've been intuiting my way forward, I might go back in this kind of, much more analytical mode to kind of to troubleshoot. But I don't generally do that unless, I feel that something is awry.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you start off, you think you're writing about one character, but then now it turns out that you're actually writing about another character.
Right.
Somebody else has taken over your book, and then you have to think, oh, wait a minute. That's actually the book is actually about this person. It's not really about that person.
How is the process different for you writing a short story versus a novel?
Well, that's the short story is, I always ever say, a novel is a marriage and a short story is an affair. I mean, a short story, you just a couple of lines, a situation, you just
Mhm.
kind of sit down and like, oh, that's interesting. And just, sit down, see what happens, and then see what happens.
Okay.
Kind of, yeah, no, I mean, some of my best known work has happened just that way.
Mhm,
I just kind of sit down and say, well, what if I try this, and that's like the opening story for Thank You, Mr. Nixon was that way.
mhm,
I just thought, God, I really need something. If this is gonna be a collection, I really need to do something around Nixon's visit to China, and I didn't really know what to do, I mean, I had no idea. And I just thought, well, what about this, some girl is writing to Richard Nixon in hell.
Well,
She's
that's
in heaven, but he's in hell. And I just, well, that's, you know what I mean? I just kind of wrote down and like, dear Mr. Nixon,
uh-huh,
and,
and then you just keep
and there,
going.
and there it was,
Mhm,
I mean, and there it was. And I don't really know, do you know what I mean? I don't know why that occurred to me.
mhm.
I don't know why, you know?
But in any event, it sounds like over and over you kind of let things take their course.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
don't let them get out of control, but you let them take their course and you work with the material
Yeah,
as opposed to people who are more like, I know what I'm going to do.
yeah.
I agree. I mean, I remember in my MFA program, people talking about outlining and thinking, what? How could you ever do that? That's amazing.
There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. And the funny thing,
Mhm,
I mean, the funniest thing that for some people that works.
mhm. Yeah,
It's a little bit
yeah.
like if you've never ever known any chess players, they're all playing the same game, but they're playing so differently.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they're not doing the same thing at all.
Mhm.
But they are actually all playing chess, and some of them quite successfully. So it's really hard to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's
So and now I'm going to ask, this is a question that every lecture I've ever been in comes up, and it may be annoying, but I'm going to ask it because people always want to know. You've been writing for a long time. I mean, when would you say, when was your first book published?
1990, 1991.
Okay, it's a long time. Do you have a kind of writing practice? Has it changed? Is there something that you count on? Again, because this is one of the things that people, especially when they're floundering around and people say, well, you should have a practice. You should have like what, what,
Mm.
how do you write?
Well, mostly I have to say that I'm very lucky in that I have a cabin in Vermont to which I
Mhm,
can repair. And when I'm there, I just kind of get up, do some yoga, and just write all day, and maybe take a break later on, and then write some more. And I just kind of write and write and write,
mhm.
till it's time to come home to Cambridge and go see people and be normal.
Right.
So I don't really I don't have routines to get me going or anything like that. But I tell you, what I used to tell my students was that, they should just park their bottoms on their chair and just put their hands on the keyboard and move their fingers. And,
Mhm.
and they should just do that. That I'm going to sit there for an hour and see what happens. So a certain amount of that is a kind of like, well, and you see what happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if you don't just sit, if you're not there, you're not going to know what's going to happen. So,
Mhm,
that would be my advice.
mhm,
A lot of people have other techniques. For example, they'll leave off at a certain point and then they'll go back and they know they'll go back and they're going to rewrite that section before they keep on going on. You
mhm.
So John Optic used to do that. He called it shingling. So some people do that. Some people leave themselves with like a little assignment for the next day. I'm going to work on this. I'm nowhere near as organized as that. I just work until I'm tired and then I go to sleep and then I wake up
Mhm.
and like I say, these people are much more disciplined than I am.
Well, and that's what's interesting for somebody who, again, is sort of trying to figure out how to be a writer. It's sort of it helps to, and then you can say, oh, that sounds like how I'd like to do it versus, you get a sense of what's sort of possible out there when sometimes it can feel very lonely and weird when you're all by yourself. Um, but I'm going to bounce back to Bad Bad Girl right now because there was another thing that I wanted to just bring out about that to sort of, because it's so much about the mother-daughter relationship, it's also important to note that you have a lot of men in this book. And my profession in real life is a therapist.
Mm.
And I was struck by the way in which you really present what a system the family is. And even that connects to sort of the larger cultural system. You were talking before about your mother's mother didn't laugh, and all of the kind of patriarchal, just to use that word easily, no, it comes down into the family, which comes down into how do individual men and women navigate this. How much were you sort of conscious of that as you were presenting men and women and marriages and families?
Yeah, I don't think, oh, this is so patriarchal.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's, to me, that stuff is the kiss of death, even though by the time all is said and done, I mean, sexism is what, patriarchy is absolutely there. And I use, the opening poem, is very much about patriarchy. Um, but, I'm just telling it like it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not, I don't have like an orthodoxy that I have in mind. I don't
Right.
have a point. I don't have a stance.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying what happened,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm much more about, yeah, I'm just trying to tell a story.
And I think that's one of the joys of being a novelist, is in a way you get to understand who the men are as well.
Yeah.
And by understanding who the men are and what the stresses and pressures and, who they are, you kind of you have the system. You have the men and the women as individuals in this individual family. Be-
Yeah, people have remarked that, and well, both that there's a system or that, there are just so many characters,
Mhm.
I mean, and that I don't lose my way and they don't become confused, the book doesn't lose focus even though there's so many characters. And I think that, in terms of, I do think there's some reflection in that very observation and the fact that I can do that. And, in the fact that I come from a highly interdependent culture. My
Mhm.
mother's culture is highly interdependent, but I grew up in a highly independent, individualistic culture.
Yes.
So I am kind of fully hybrid.
Mhm.
And I think that you can see in this book that I can do both. Do you know what I mean? In other words, I can hear both channels. So this is not all about, my interiority. It's all about me. You know what I mean? But my interiority is also there. So it is both about the individual and it is about the context. And it's about both. But I
Mhm.
think that I think that my interest probably also in wanting to portray, um, my idea about when I sort of say, well, I want to say what happened. But
Mhm.
what happened, involves so many things.
Right. What
And
happened
and
happened to everybody.
I
Yeah.
think that's the interdependent part of me that cannot,
Mhm.
that, if you think about all those studies, I'm sure you know them about, the way that, people in different fields from different cultures will perceive, an object in a field, like a lion in a savanna,
Mhm.
and people from Western cultures will see the lion, they see the object, and people from Eastern cultures see the savanna.
Mhm.
And I think what you can see in this book is that I see both the lion and the savanna.
Mhm. Yeah. And
I think
so,
as a gift of being a daughter of immigrants. I mean,
right.
I'm lucky that way.
Yeah. I mean, as you talk, I hear, more and more how central, well, how could it not be? It's who you are. And you've been able to sort of bring it into your writing again in a way that I think speaks to so many people some of whom have more than one culture that's, they're embedded in them. But even I think if you don't, I mean, if you feel basically mono, I don't, and I don't know how many people are even monocultural. I mean, it really, it's pretty hard to be. Um, so I, it sounds like you do, but I just want to ask, do you feel like with this book, you did what you hoped to do?
Yeah, I do. I do. I mean, to my surprise, let me
Hmm.
say. I mean, I think that, you can hear me at the end of this book as I'm remembering the moments when I started the book. Um, I was not sure I could do it because there's so many extremely painful memories in this book.
Yeah.
And there is a way in which, I am an author and I am aware that, writing is not therapy, you know. Therapy is, I remember this terrible thing. I am completely overwhelmed with, with whatever, fill in the blank.
Hmm.
And the therapist hands you, the Kleenex, right?
Hmm.
And that's not what a book is, So a book is you remember those things, you're completely embedded in them, you completely can kind of relive them, and also you are above and narrating. So, it's like being in a movie where you're both the actress and the director, you
Hmm.
know, but no director, no book. Do you know what I mean? In other words, the book really, you need that you need that directorial, um,
Hmm.
I want to say poise,
Hmm.
you need that directorial solidity and dispassion.
Hmm.
And I was not sure I could do that, even though, this is my 10th book, but I think that what I saw as I wrote the book was that actually all of that training and being the author held,
Hmm.
that I could revisit even very, very painful things. And I could be both Gish Jen the daughter and Gish Jen the author
Yeah.
and Gish Jen a person who can see my younger self, my poor younger self, but it could also see my mother,
Hmm.
And so I was, I guess I was relieved really, to find that I could do that. And I think it says so much about, the real gift of being a writer,
Hmm.
it's that, all of that training and point of view, you fill in the blank, all of that training, all that craftsmanship, finally, you really internalize it and it really changes you. It changes you and you can structure experience no matter how bad it is. You can you can structure it and it will be both really bad. Well, and I guess I'm sort of saying and material.
Yeah. Well,
So it's kind of it's both of those things. And for me, I was like I say, I've um I was relieved to find that I could do this with material that for me was so loaded.
well, it's before we started, I had read you the sentence that comes toward the end of your book that stood out for me about, how it was relentless, some of what happened and how hard it was. And in the end, it also helped make you a writer, and I think that's true. And I will just say, reading it, I could feel the relentlessness, and that's a compliment. But there were times when reading it again, because it brought up, and my mother's been dead for 25 years, you were able to sort of bring such difficult stuff to the surface that gives the reader a way to enter it, that I had to put the book down and kind of, well, but this is a compliment, and it's not a bad thing in the sense that what was getting me was the truth. It wasn't someone else's story. It was like, oh yeah, I remember that. And to have that, be brought to me, that's okay, that's my life, that's my mother. And there's the encouragement to say, and where did she come from? You know, which so again, you were managed it and conveyed so much of the pain in a way that I think is what a reader kind of wants in a way. I mean, why else do we read books, but
Mhm.
to feel alive that way. So, yeah. So, we're gonna have to wind up in a couple of minutes. There's nothing particularly in the chat except your website is in the chat, so people should look for that. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you want to make sure you get to say?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Sometimes people have one thing that they wish they could have
Oh,
said.
no, no, no. And I have to say, the truth to tell, I've given so many interviews about
Right.
this, but I don't really have this feeling of being pent up and
Okay. All right. So sometimes people
and,
still have
and that
something.
no one is interested in some aspect of it. I feel like, oh my God, pretty much
Yeah. Yeah.
everything that is one could possibly ask me has been asked at this
Okay.
point. I think, maybe there's something else.
Okay.
But anyway, but you
And
certainly covered a lot of ground, and I hope that it's been helpful to your listeners.
yeah, and I think again, what I want to we talked a lot about this latest book, but to just say that your body of work is really varied. I mean, when I looked at the earlier novels, it's kind of what you were mentioning, there's a lot, you can see there's a lot of you in them in the sense that you drew on your life to create fictional characters. And then, later on, you seem to sort of widen into a world. I mean, baseball. I mean, well, I love baseball, but the Thank You, Mr. Nixon. I mean, I think your range is wonderful and actually inspiring to a writer that, yeah, you could do this and you can do this and you can do this. And then, sort of, I don't know where you'll go from here, but the kind of bad, bad girl sort of giving yourself that room to do what you've described doing, which is wonderful. So thank you very, very much. And I'm going to do some closing comments. Um, welcome to stay for the comments, whatever works for you. But
Thank you so
big,
much for having me. I think I'll.
oh, it was wonderful to end the fact that you were in the room, that, you were a member of the room. When were you in the room?
I actually was never a member. That's
Oh, I thought
inaccurate.
you were.
What is true is that there's a fellowship named for me, and that was very kind. They did that because I donated the proceeds of one
Mm-hmm.
of my readings to the
Oh, good.
point,
Well,
and so they named a fellowship after me. But
that's
I
great.
myself never
Okay.
actually the book there.
Well, your books are there.
Oh, well,
So
good.
if you walk in, they're on the shelf with other room
Well,
people.
I think it was just seen that I was a supporter.
Yeah, well, we were
I am
grateful
a supporter, not I
and
was a supporter. I
you're still
am a
grateful.
supporter.
So anyway, I just wanted to thank you for sharing about your books, your experience. And I also want to thank Leslie Ostro, who is our uh, program director and also, for my sake, a technical person because I am not. And so she comes to my rescue every time I do one of these. Again, this will be recorded, it will be on our website. So if you want to hear it again or you want to tell a friend who wants to hear it, it will be there. Our next interview will be coming up in the winter time, and that will be announced, so you can look that up. And in the meantime, just look for announcements on the website for the readings from the room, again, for the upcoming interview in the winter, and all the events that we've been creating in the room for people to come in and meet with other writers and write with other writers. And really, again, now that we're really pandemic free, to be able to enjoy community as well as the quiet and solitude during most of the time at the writer's room. So good night, and thank you again for everybody who's listened, either now or later on the website, and have a wonderful rest of the evening. Good night, everybody.